Hello everyone. In part 3 of the series, Breaking Point in the Russia-Ukraine War, we will continue to analyze the strategic calculations of the parties when the conflict broke out. While watching the video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and leave your comments so we can be motivated to serve you better. Sincerely thank. Ladies and gentlemen, in the previous part 2, we discussed the wisdom of President Zelensky in persuading the West to support, through practical actions, the goal of building advantage at the negotiating table with Russia right from the first days of the conflict. We have witnessed a 180-degree change in the West's perspective, from the initial assumption that Ukraine would collapse, to now believing that the Russian army is weak. Russia will be afraid and economically collapse under the orders of Russia. Western embargo. At the same time, he believes that Putin and the Russian leadership do not have the ability to continue fighting to the end. That is why the West has prevented Ukraine from signing a peace agreement with Russia, even though the terms were almost accepted by both sides after 17 drafts, leading to strong statements from the West that Russia will pay a heavy price for its actions and that, in fact, the West is paying the price. Western officials emphasize that to end this war, Putin needs to relinquish power in Moscow, signaling that Russia needs to be defeated on the battlefield. To achieve this goal, the West has provided comprehensive aid to Ukraine, including weapons, economic support, and human resources, including NATO veteran volunteers. They have increased technical intelligence support to Ukraine, including satellite surveillance and reconnaissance, and real-time intelligence delivery to Ukraine. The West also conducts many activities to isolate Russia in economic, diplomatic and cultural aspects. NATO leaders have made direct visits to the region to show support for Ukraine. The West's economic, diplomatic and cultural anti-Russian activities have reached their highest level, unprecedented comprehensiveness in human history. Zelensky started the war with an effort to force the West to support him so that he would have the strength to negotiate with Russia, to restore peace with the most favorable conditions possible for Ukraine. During a year of war, the total amount of Western aid to Ukraine from military to economic was about $150 billion. This number is 2.5 times higher than the Russian defense budget in 2021, $65.9 billion, and 25 times higher than the Ukrainian defense budget in 2020, $5.9 billion. This number is huge and more than enough for Zelensky's original goal of having peace for Ukraine, but the West wants Ukraine to defeat Russia on the battlefield. With that goal and such support, it was a disaster for Ukraine. In other words, instead of peace, Zelensky receives aid that cannot stop the war. If the content of this part 3 makes you think that Russia is vague and completely believes in Zelensky's negotiations, that is a gross underestimation of Russia. The proverb, "If you want peace, prepare for war," is a lesson all leaders know. In fact, since 2014, Russia has conducted a series of activities to protect its interests. These activities include efforts to save peace, negotiate their conclusion, and struggle to realize the Minsk agreements, along with preparations for war. These activities take place in many aspects: economic, political, cultural and military, to prepare for both peace and war. After a while, since Russia's special military campaign began, the results of 8 years of preparation have shown a rather smooth transformation of Russian society, economy and defense industry from a state of peace to a semi-wartime state without experiencing shocks as the West predicted. Such shocks include price spikes, sudden changes in energy availability, and the sudden arrival of refugees. If you think that Russia's military strategy in the early stages was not drastic enough or that it fought under the illusion of its strength, then you are wrong. Historically, the Ukrainian battlefield was a battlefield that every officer cadet, From low to high in the Soviet, Russian and Ukrainian armies later on had to study while sitting in military school. World War II shaped the military doctrine of the Soviet Union and later Russia. During this fierce war, Ukraine became one of the most important battlefields of the Patriotic War, which witnessed the bitter defeats and also the most glorious victories of the Soviet Army. In particular, in 1941, around the Kiev area, 655,000 Red Army soldiers were surrounded, destroyed or captured. This was the largest siege in history. At the same place, in 1943 and 1944, all 6 Soviet tank armies, that is, all the main tank armies that the Red Army had at that time, continuously attacked and pushed the Germans back. Precisely because of the importance of Ukraine, where 6 tank armies of the Red Army were still stationed, the German General Staff devoted all its attention to the defense of Ukraine in the second half of 1944, and did not let attention to the Red Army's preparations for the Bagration campaign in Belarus. This campaign became the most spectacular Allied victory against the Germans in World War II. When studying the Red Army's liberation of Ukraine from German yoke in 1944, Russian officers all understood that this was a war that lasted about 8 months. During that time, the Red Army with about 2.3 million troops, nearly 29,000 artillery and mortars, 2,000 tanks and 2,370 aircraft fought against 1.8 million German troops, nearly 17,000 artillery and mortars, along with 2,200 tanks and nearly 1,500 soldiers. Plain. This was an uncompromising war, where the Germans destroyed everything in their retreat, while the Red Army, in its advance, was forced to destroy everything that could serve as a refuge. For the German army, if we believe what the Western press reports, that with only 100,000 soldiers of the First Army, the Russian army can take over Ukraine in just a few weeks, or even within 3 days, then we are the naive people. The map we are looking at is the map of Russia's military force layout before the attack. Map of Ukraine drawn on February 14, 2022, just 10 days before hostilities began. From this map, we see that Russian forces are concentrated in 5 clusters. The first cluster is in Belarus. The second cluster is the Kursk Canal Line. The third cluster is Oryan-Voronezh. The fourth cluster is Rostov-on-Don. And the fifth cluster is Crimea. These army groups are scattered, but when the war actually begins, Russia's battlefield is divided into 2 main fronts. Each of these fronts applies a very different form of warfare. The Kiev front, for example, was carried out by 2 army groups, one located in Belarus and the other in the Klintsy direction. This formation includes 22 battalion-level combat groups, referred to as BTG. Each BTG consists of about 800 soldiers, of which 200 are infantry and the rest are tank, armored, technical artillery and logistics crews. The total number of troops participating in the battle on the Kiev front was no more than 22,500 troops. However, this number is only nominal, because in reality, among the troops in Belarus, only 2/3 of them actually entered Ukraine, equivalent to about 15,000 troops, while the remaining corps is kept in Belarus as a reserve and to prevent the Ukrainian army from attacking from the west through Belarusian territory. So the actual number of Russian troops fighting in Ukraine is only about a quarter of them, a total of 4,000 infantry. This unit, with a total of about 15,000 people, is located along the area of about 30,000 square kilometers that Russia captured in the first days of the war north and northwest of Kiev, meaning on average each Russian soldier must be responsible for 2 square kilometers of captured land. With such a limited number of infantry, it was clear that the Russian side could not maintain a continuous front line. This led to strange situations early in the war, such as Russian armored vehicles breaking down, being left unattended and then being towed home by Ukrainian farmers or tractors. Were Ukrainian commando units that penetrated deep into the rear lines and ambushed logistics convoys. Now, if you still believe the propaganda of NATO generals that Russian troops can occupy Ukraine in 3 days, that is absurd. Because Russian generals, who were forced to study the Ukrainian battlefield from 1941 to 1945 in military school and went through 4 wars, including 2 Chechen wars in 1996 and 2000, the War Georgia in 2008, and the war in Syria from 2015 to present. The NATO generals, except the US, do not have this experience. So the question is, how did the Russians actually conduct the war during the first 2 months of the conflict? When observing the 2 fronts on the map, we can clearly see the distribution of Russian forces is very uneven. About 77% of the force, that is 77,500 people, fought in Donbass, while only about 23% of the force, equivalent to 22,500 men, was on the Kiev front. Of this total of 22,500 people, only about 75%, or 15,000 people, actually participated in the war. However, the images we saw through the Western media in the early days showed that up to 90% of the war activities were concentrated on the Kiev front. The reason is quite simple. This area has more Western reporters and the activities of Ukrainian commandos are stronger because the Russian army cannot maintain a continuous front line, and this is also a key area with political decisiveness for Ukraine. Most images of captured tanks or ambushed and destroyed troops are concentrated in this area, as Russian field commanders had no choice but to maintain constant pressure on the Ukrainian army pushed in, hoping that the Ukrainian army, having to deal with these deep thrusts, would not be able to attack their vacant rear. Meanwhile, right on the eve of war, the Ukrainian army received a large addition of troops from the west. The difference in numbers between the 2 sides can be clearly seen in some confrontations between Russian and Ukrainian troops. Most typically, at the Battle of Berdyansk airport, on the first day of the war, 200 Russian special forces landed and occupied this strategic airport of the capital. Over the next 3 days, Ukraine mobilized about 4,000 soldiers to attack to retake the airport, with the infantry ratio up to 20 times superior to the Russian defense force. However, Russian special forces were able to hold the airport until other ground troops arrived as reinforcements. During the surprise attacks on the Kiev front line, the Russian army caused considerable shock to Kiev and the west. Just 1 day after the first shots were fired, President Zelensky instructed the FSB to destroy all documents related to U.S. biological laboratories on Ukrainian territory. The destruction of this document was accidentally recorded by a CNBC reporter. On February 25, right in the context of tension, Ukrainian troops opened the dam to release floodwaters, inundating the Demidov region in the north, hindering the advance of Russian troops. In the weeks that followed, the Western press reported on a 40 kilometers long military convoy entering Ukraine from Belarus, and when entering Ukraine, this convoy lengthened to 60 kilometers long. As of April 2022, Ukrainian officials told the New York Times that they had no regrets about flooding residential areas to deter Russian troops. At the same time, the Ukrainian government distributed submachine guns to anyone willing to take up arms to fight against the Russians. Amid the emergency, 17,000 guns were issued, and young Ukrainians began preparing gasoline bombs to fight Russian tanks on the streets. Afterwards, Russian troops announced a temporary halt in their offensive to show goodwill for peace negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations in Belarus. Arriving there, we saw the 60 kilometers long military convoy that the Western press reported had evaporated. When April came, with the appointment of General Dvornikov as commander-in-chief of Russian troops in Ukraine and the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kharkov and Kiev to Donbass, Ukrainian officials believed that each attack on the Kiev front was a decisive action. Calculate. However, now, after some time, when looking back, we can realize that, if President Zelensky thought he had tricked Putin into sitting at the negotiating table just to buy time, then in fact, he made a big mistake. During that time-buying period, Russian forces, with about 15,000 troops actually fighting in the northern region of Kiev, could do nothing to capture the Ukrainian capital. By now, it is clear that Putin himself fooled everyone when he said he was withdrawing from that area to facilitate negotiations. People were fooled into thinking that the Russians had lost the war, and in June 2022, Putin laughed in an interview and said, "We have really begun in earnest the war in Ukraine." Then people say, "You're lying." However, looking back a year later, we see that 15,000 Russian troops in North Kiev have distracted us all from Donbass and the south, where 77,000 Russian troops, including 28,000 Donbass militiamen, are located, corresponding to more than 80% of their troops, along with the commanders who later became known to the world as Dvornikov, Zitko and Surovikin, fought in the early days of the war from February to April 2022. We were sidetracked by ambushes around Kiev, reports of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, constant statements of the parties, Zelensky's live stream without realizing that the main Ukrainian troops is being crushed in the south. Looking at the map, we can see that Russia's largest army group is concentrated in Crimea, with troops much larger than other army groups, 1.5 to twice as many, and is supported by firepower from Black Sea Fleet. Russian units stationed in Crimea are also the best fighting units and have been in a constant state of combat readiness since 2014, unlike other military groups deployed from the interior to near the border. In the form of exercises. The Crimea cluster, coming directly from the peninsula, has been positioned as a fortress since 2014 and has advanced directly into Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet's approach to Odessa, sinking and damaging almost all of the warships of the Ukrainian Navy, and the sea blockade of this country has created great pressure on Russia's military group in Ukraine, and forced them to maintain a significant portion of their forces to resist an amphibious landing by sea, an amphibious landing that was not real. This caused Russia's army group from Crimea to quickly overcome the defense line that Ukraine had built for 8 years to isolate Crimea. We often hear about Ukraine's control line, for the Donbass region. This is a battle line built over 8 years, surrounding the Donbass open area with a system of strong points built and reinforced. However, we rarely hear about the defense line that Ukraine built to isolate Crimea right after Russia occupied the region and annexed it in 2014. If the war had happened right before 2014, then Sevastopol at that time, it still belonged to Ukraine and was still Russia's strongest military base in the south. Russian soldiers in this area are also trained and maintained at the highest state of combat readiness. Russia's bloodless occupation of Crimea in 2014 is the clearest evidence of the superior qualifications of Russian units here. After its occupation, Russia turned the peninsula into a fortress, not only to fend off an attack from Ukraine but also to deal with potential incursions from NATO. We still remember that, right at the time Russia occupied Crimea, U.S. Navy warships entered the Black Sea from the Mediterranean for the first time and approached Sevastopol. This led to a confrontation between the Russian Navy and American warships, which culminated when Russian surface-to-sea missile units were put on combat readiness and Russian aircraft took over the warships. America was the target for dive and bombing exercises, forcing American ships to retreat. Ukrainians also know that the Russian army has reinforced its forces in Crimea, and over the past 8 years, the Russian army group here has been the army group with the largest concentration and highest combat readiness in the whole country. Russia. The best officers of the Russian army, such as Generals Dvornikov and Surovikin, were tested in Syria and upon their return also served there. The Ukrainians clearly understood that if those who broke through the line of control in Donbass were mainly Donbass militiamen, then in Crimea the attackers would be Russia's most elite units. However, the terrain between Crimea and Kiev in Ukraine is very favorable for defense. This map shows us that the Crimean Peninsula is only connected to the mainland of Ukraine by two unique roads, with seas and large lakes on both sides. This makes the defenders only need to know how to cut off these two roads, the red area, so it will be difficult for the attacker, even if they are much stronger, to overcome them. In June 1942, the German army had to pay a heavy price when advancing from the mainland to the south through these two strips of land to occupy Crimea. Ukraine's defense system is built on geographical advantages and has been continuously strengthened over the past 8 years. It is designed not only to defend the mainland in the event of a Russian attack, but also to encircle and reduce Crimea's resistance in case Ukraine recaptures the peninsula. Therefore, activities to sabotage the water transmission system for agriculture and domestic use, as well as the electricity supply system for the peninsula, were carried out. Transportation routes were destroyed to isolate the peninsula. However, in February 2022, while the whole world watched Zelensky's live streams and counted the tanks captured by Ukrainian farmers near Kiev, Russian troops overcame this entire line of defense. If we search for video images of the southern fronts of Ukraine, we will mainly see images of Ukrainian military convoys destroyed on the roads, Air Force military bases being destroyed, and bases with weapons and military equipment were left behind because the Russian army advanced too quickly. While we were busy following the sensational story in the Western media, Melitopol and Kherson were lost to the Russian army with almost no fighting. This happened because Ukrainian units were routed at the defense line facing the Crimean Peninsula in the south. The siege of Ukraine's most elite forces, almost all Marine Corps units and Azov nationalist units in Melitopol, is the clearest demonstration of the collapse of the southern armies. South of Ukraine. From Simferopol, the departure point of Russian troops on the Crimean Peninsula to Mariupol is 365 kilometers. From Maximov, a Russian town near Mariupol, the city is 60 kilometers east. The Ukrainian army in Mariupol held off the Russian army within this 60 kilometers distance for a month but was eventually surrounded by Surovikin's army from the south after covering a distance 6 times longer than 365 kilometers. This same force of Surovikin, after destroying the Ukrainian army in Mariupol, advanced to the northeast and, together with Zhitko's Central Army, occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, marking the end of the second phase of the war. All of these successes in the south, along with Ukraine's heavy losses, were not known to the world because the collapse happened so quickly, and the region had no reporters present. The West because they focused on the Kiev front. As for Russia, they do not release many images because their goal is to maintain the image of a successful military campaign with little bloodshed, a scenario similar to Crimea in 2014 but in the 2022 version. Up to now, you can see that, in the first phase of the war from February 2022 until Mariupol was completely surrounded on March 18, 2022 by Surovikin's Crimean wing, 77,000 Russian troops, accounting for nearly 80% of their forces, waged a real blitzkrieg war. There is no polite war here, war with a gloved hand. As a result of this attack, Russian troops quickly penetrated Ukraine's defense line to isolate Crimea, with almost no losses. The defeat of the Southern Army Group caused Ukraine to quickly lose Kherson, the first major city to be lost to Russia, followed by Melitopol. These are strategic cities with the entire rail and road system connecting Crimea and Donbass running through them lost without major attacks. From November 2022 until now, after Russia withdrew from Kherson, Melitopol, is the city that Ukrainian media has always mentioned that their upcoming counterattack is aimed at, and if successful, will cut the strip of land in half, connecting Donbass and Crimea. However, at the beginning of the war, even with such a strategic nature, the Russian army did not have to fight big to capture it. Next was Berdyansk, which the Russians later turned into a sea transportation center for the Russian army. And finally Mariupol, the command center of the Ukrainian war to siege Donbass for 8 years, is the end of Ukraine's most elite forces. At the outbreak of the war, the Marines and Azov along with the Ukrainian Navy and a large part of the Air Force ended. We cannot see all of the above in the media. Although information about this campaign in the south is not widely published, we know that 2/4 of the total commanders of Russian troops in Ukraine are generals who have directed important battles here. These are General Dvornikov and General Surovikin. The first person, General Dvornikov, was the man who defeated Donetsk and Luhansk. After capturing Luhansk, General Dvornikov was replaced by General Gennady Zhitko, director of the Russian Army's political directorate. The reason is that Mr. Dvornikov wants to continue the war thoroughly, while Putin wants to enter a second phase of peace negotiations through Turkey, an issue we will discuss later. The second person is General Surovikin, who replaced General Gennady Zhitko after the retreat in South Kharkov and is currently the leader of the Ukrainian front. There are many who believe that Surovikin fell out of favor and was replaced by General Valery Gerasimov. However, this actually gives Surovikin greater power, as the general is the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces and Deputy Defense Minister of Russia. In these two positions, he can directly issue orders to all naval, land, and air forces throughout Russia and abroad, as well as order and purchase weapons and war supplies from defense enterprises. If in the past, when Surovikin was commander-in-chief of Russian troops in Ukraine, all his requests for the war would have to be submitted to the Russian Ministry of Defense, then go through the entire bureaucratic system, be approved, and then be approved, was recently implemented, but this will no longer be the case. For example, if General Surovikin needed a special forces force to lay mines under the bridges in Odessa, in the past he would have had to contact the Ministry of Defense to request the number of these forces. The Ministry of Defense must then contact the Naval Command, then the Pacific Fleet Command to gather frogmen from these units. Then, in order to have a submarine take this force to land, he had to contact the Black Sea Fleet so they could arrange the ship. If you want a long-range missile attack to distract the enemy while the frogmen approach, then you must contact the Ministry of Defense so they can mobilize missile forces on the ground and on Navy ships, troops and on Air Force aircraft to proceed. And if the number of missiles is not enough, then he must go through the Ministry of Defense to work with the General Logistics Department to be able to get missiles from Kaliningrad or from the Far East. All of those processes have now been cut off, because you only need to report to General Gerasimov and he, after receiving the request as commander of the Ukrainian front, will use his capacity as Deputy Defense Minister to requires missiles and the Chief of General Staff to mobilize the Navy and Air Force. Therefore, with this mechanism, General Surovikin's power was greatly expanded and, essentially, he had the right to mobilize most of the forces of the Russian Federation, except nuclear forces, in the war. Just as Putin said, Russia will devote every. So, to summarize the problem, in the first 2 months of the war, contrary to what we still think, Zelensky tricked Russia into a negotiation game to buy time. In fact, the Russians alone on the one hand, enthusiastically participating in that game on the Kiev front, on the other hand, waging an unceremonious, uncompromising war in the east and south with 15% of the force on the other front. They made the West was so frightened in the early stages that it opened the door for President Zelensky to escape. They caused such panic in the Kiev area that on the second day of the war, They released water from the dam to flood residential areas. This flooding lasted until the end of March 2022 to block the advance of the army numbered no more than 15,000 people in an area of 30,000 square kilometers. In the east and south, 80% of Russian forces carried out a blitzkrieg, overcoming Ukrainian defenses that had been built over 8 years and capturing a series of important cities. Destroy Ukraine's most core forces on land, in the air and at sea. If we, ordinary people, don't know this, do Western leaders know? We are confident that Zelensky, along with the leaders of the US, UK, France and Germany, understand these things. However, they did not say it because it did not suit their goals, after seeing that the coup did not happen and the Ukrainian army continued to fight. They set a goal for Ukraine to defeat the Russian army, not to achieve peace. With that goal, they ignored the story in the east and south, focusing only on propaganda for the Kiev front. As for Russia, Putin still hopes that, after the eastern and southern armies of Ukraine are defeated, the Zelenskys will have to sit down at the real negotiating table, not just act like in the first 2 months. This time, Putin hopes for the West's sobriety in the face of the battlefield situation, Turkey's mediation and the sobriety of the Ukrainian leadership. If a peace agreement is reached now, blood will stop being shed on both sides. However, Putin's hopes were once again dashed and the war reached a point of no return. Thing necessary to the military in Ukraine. Part 3 will stop here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share and leave comments. Press the follow bell to receive notifications of the latest sequel.